Okay, welcome back to our Faith and Revelation class. We're on chapter 4, and today we're looking at the Old Testament and how the Old Testament prepares the way for Christ. And so some of this, if you've been with us throughout these classes, throughout the years, will be a little bit of a review, but these are really good things to review, and then we'll get into some of the implications for that for us as we talk about faith and how God reveals Himself to us. And so what we want to do is just review really quickly last class, because I think it was really important and some good stuff that was covered there. And so one of the things that we talked about last class is the fact that we need divine revelation. So we need God to reveal God's self to us, right? Because not all truths about God can be known through our thinking alone, right? I can't think my way all the way to all those teachings that God gives us. I can't think my way to the fact that, it's good to help poor people. It doesn't make sense at first, right? So God has to reveal some of these things to us that we can then use our reason to test out, but we can't think our way to all these things that God tells us had God not come to us and revealed Himself to us and taught us in the first place. Okay, so God has to reveal Himself to us, and He does that. And then God reveals Himself to us out of love, right? Not to make us slaves. He creates us out of love and reveals Himself to us out of love because He loves us and He wants us to know Him, and He wants us to know what it is that's going to be a key to us finding happiness and freedom and moving away from and breaking free from all that stuff that really enslaves us. Our proper response to God's revelation is faith. So when God reveals God's self to us, the response to that, the proper response, is to have faith, to believe that God is not lying, to trust that revelation. That's the faith. Faith is this response in what we hear when God reveals Himself to us. When we have faith, that then allows us to begin to understand and know more about the things that God's revealing to us. We talked last class about how once we believe that God is telling us the truth and we try to live some of those things that He's teaching us and revealing to us, we start to see this works, right? That God is actually telling me things that are good, that are true, that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. And then finally, faith and reason, faith in God and our intelligence, our reason, our ability to think, work together to help us discover truth, right? Reason helps me get some of the way towards God. My thinking, my science, all these things get me some of the way down the path to a recognition that God is true and good and telling us the truth. And faith also then helps my reason, helps my science. It helps me to know and learn more things that I wouldn't have known on my own. So there's this interplay, and they help build each other up, faith and reason. Okay, so a really important class last class. All right, this is, as we move into this new chapter about the Old Testament, really important to just hit some of these again. The fact that God, right after the fall, in the very third chapter of Genesis, starts making covenants with humanity. Covenants, relationships, contracts in a sense, but more than a contract, it's a relationship type of thing, right? Built on trust and love in that sense. It's between friends or family members or people who have a really strong relationship. And so this journey that God and us travel down through the Old Testament and up to today is known as salvation history, right? The history of what God has done to save us, okay? So these covenants are made. I want to talk about 5 of them that we want to draw and kind of make as the key covenants that God has made with us, particularly in the Old Testament. We want to talk about the covenants that God made with Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. Okay? So, in the covenant God makes with Adam and Eve, in that third chapter of Genesis, God is already promising in that third chapter of Genesis that there will be a Savior that is coming. Okay? I will put enmity between you and the devil and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So God is predicting and is letting us know that there is a child coming, right, who is going to be the adversary of the devil, right, who is going to destroy. It doesn't necessarily, but there's this reference that there's a child coming that's going to be the adversary of the enemy, of the adversary of the devil. Okay, so kind of preparing this way that there's a Savior that will come all of this will be made right already in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. As God is expelling them from the Garden of Eden for their sin, he's also saying, I will make this, I will bring a Savior. And so we see this foreshadowing in this covenant that God makes with Adam and Eve, the first sort of covenant that takes place. There's 4 other covenants that follow. Okay, pretty soon after that, we have the flood, and the covenant then that God makes with Noah after the flood is that I will never again destroy humanity. Okay, I will never again destroy humanity. So what we see in these covenants, first of all, too, is there's various promises that are made in it and foreshadowings of the final covenant that God makes with us through His Son. But we also see the grouping of people expanding. So Adam and Eve is a couple, right? It's a marriage that God makes this covenant with. He makes this covenant with one married couple. And then He makes this covenant with Noah, and which is a family. Noah and his family were the only ones that survived the flood. So God makes a covenant with this family of Noah. God then goes on and makes several chapters later in Genesis, God then also makes a covenant with Abraham. He says, I will make of you a great nation, right, with descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. So God makes this covenant with Abraham and says, I want to make a covenant, right, with your entire tribe, if you will, right? And then what happens is in the covenant with Moses, we'll talk about each of these again, but again we see this expanding. God comes to an entire nation, right, and says, you will be my people and I will be your God, right? He comes to these Jewish people, these Israelite people, and establishes this new nation. But then with David, the covenant that God makes with David in the Old Testament, he talks about the fact that a descendant of David would come and be the Son of God. And so we see this covenant that God is making now, in fact, with an entire kingdom. Okay? So, anyways, just to look at again at these. So we have the covenant with Adam, that there will be in the 3rd chapter of Genesis and Eve, Adam and Eve, that there would be a son that would be coming, a child who would be coming to fight the devil and win. Covenant with Noah, God says, this is the sign I am making between me and you, and every living being that is with you for perpetual generations. It shall be a covenant between me and the earth and all of you, Genesis chapter 9. Okay? Here we see an image of God calling Abraham out of his homeland and telling him, I want you to go travel to this new place, where this promised land, in a sense, that I will be establishing. So he's calling him to Israel, which would eventually become Israel, Jerusalem, the Holy Land. Okay, so God calls Abraham, and Abraham goes and trusts God and takes off and heads to the promised land. We then see, again, this covenant that God enters into with Moses and all of the people, where God gives Moses the law, and the law is brought down, and this law is this entering into this relationship with this entire tribe of people. And then, so, looking at these really quickly, we see them in a picture form, right? So, God makes this covenant with Adam and Eve, which is a marriage. God makes a covenant with Noah, which is a household or a family. Okay, and then God makes this covenant with Abraham. I will make your descendants as vast as the stars, and calls him to the Holy Land. And so God enters into and kind of creates this tribe out of Abraham. And then, of course, God enters into this covenant with Moses and the Israelite people, and founds himself this entire nation of people, and makes this his chosen people there on Mount Sinai when he gives the 10 Commandments. And then, of course, he enters into this covenant with David and establishes a kingdom under David. It says, you will be the king, one of your descendants will be the Messiah, okay, the Son of God. Okay, so the Old Testament also gives us some really great things. Lots, I mean, that was a weird statement, right? The Old Testament gives us tons and tons of great things. And it really is, I just want to encourage you to dive into the Old Testament, read through it. You got to read through the Old Testament at least once, but hopefully many times. There's so much that's there, so many awesome stories, so many things that are, it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings almost. There's just all these battles and wars and sinners and saints. and heroic people and really evil people. And you see God kind of working in the midst of all of that. And it's just a beautiful thing that many people think, well, I'm just going to read the Gospels and the New Testament maybe. But we have to know the Old Testament. There's so much there that helps us in our faith. Not just in the sense that it helps us in relationship to Christ, foreshadowing Christ, but also the stuff that's in there helps us grow closer to Christ as well, right? It's not just a foreshadowing. It's not just like the story before the story. There's so much in there in the Old Testament. So one of the things as well that we see in the Old Testament, in addition to these covenants and all these beautiful, beautiful stories, is we have the prophets that are there, right? We have these prophets that are in the Old Testament that are super important. And many of them are, very often, they're like us, right? They're called by God. God calls to them and comes to these prophets and says, I want you to be a prophet to the nations, right? Or I want you to be a prophet to your hometown, or whatever it is. Or I want you to go tell this king this message. A lot of times, the prophets, almost always, they did not believe they were up for the task. They were like, absolutely not, or you got the wrong guy, there's no way I could do that kind of thing. Eventually, they give up, and they trust God, and they say, okay, I'm going to do it. Sometimes kicking and screaming or dragging their feet, right? Jonah tries to run off first and hide in the whale, or hide on the boat, and he gets swallowed by the whale and eventually goes. All these prophets, the vast majority of them, eventually they kind of just throw their hands up and they say, okay, God, I'll be your prophet. I'll go do what you need me to do. And they become great heralds to the world. They become great people who bring messages, really important messages. And those prophets still have their messages still are directed to us too, right? There's so much richness in there. And so we need to know the prophets and we need to listen to their words and also be inspired by them to be prophets ourselves, because now we're all called to be prophets, right? When you were baptized, you were given the grace and the call to become a person who is a prophet, right? A person who goes out to the world and says the things that God is asking us to say to the world. Okay. Lots of things in the Old Testament also are types, we call them. Okay, so that's a type of, you might have heard that in literature class or English class in school, right? An archetype or a type is it is kind of, in a sense, it's like a foreshadowing, right? So take any story or any person in the Old Testament, right? There's great value, and it's a true story, and it's a story in and of itself that has great meaning and God speaking to us. But also in most of the things that occur in the Old Testament, it does provide us also, in addition to that, a nice foreshadowing of Christ as well, right? And or what God is going to be doing through Christ and in us and all that. So once we know, now you and I, we know Christ, right? And we have the advantage of looking back into the Old Testament. In addition to the value of the Old Testament in and of itself for us in our faith, we also can look back and say, wow, there's so much there that was predicting and foreshadowing and pointing to Christ and to us today, right? So we have to make sure we see that, right? So things like, Moses and the Israelites passing through the Red Sea, very beautiful. It happened. It has it's good fruit for us to meditate on that and think about what that was like and just see the power of God at work in that. But we can also say, you know what, looking back on that, that's like baptism, right? That was like baptism because here it is, these people are passing through water, right? And on the other, and they go to safety through baptism, just like you and I through baptism. We become new people. We are saved. What happens after they move through the water? The water swallows up the Egyptians. So the evil in that sense is destroyed by the water, and the Israelites come out on the other side as a saved people, right? So we can look back at that and say that's a very powerful story in and of itself, but then also we can look back at that and say that's foreshadowing, right? That's a type of what we now experience in baptism. So we can see both. We have to cherish both. And we have to know that, and we get a lot of fruit through knowing those stories. Okay. Questions then, okay? So what I want you to do, who were the first 5 covenants of God with? Who were the 5 covenants? So just list each of them out, okay? Who were the people that each of the 5 covenants God made? And then number 2, what you could just, even if you wanted to make a chart almost, okay? You could make a chart for all 3 of these. You could just have one big chart for all 3 questions. What are the first 5 covenants of God? Who are they with? Okay, second column or whatever you want to write next to that. What did God promise in each of these covenants? Okay, so what did God promise in each of the 5 covenants? And then number 3, at the end of that, just thinking about using your own reasoning ability and your own thought process. In what way do each of these 5 covenants foreshadow the final covenant that God makes with humanity through His Son Jesus? Right? So what can we see in each of these covenants that God has made with these 5 different people or in Adam and Eve? In each of these 5 covenants, what can we see? What might we think, oh, that also, that foreshadowed what God was going to do with this final covenant that He enters into us with His Son Jesus, right? And so, yeah, just think about that a little bit. Use your own thinking ability there. And those are your questions. That concludes our class for today. I hope and pray that you're doing well. And if there's anything that I can ever do to help, please let me know. Know of my prayers for you. God bless.